The ink was still wet when they pulled the ledger from her hands. Vesper noticed that first, not the laughter, not the cold, but the smear of black across her fingers where she had tried to hold on. The registrar of Thornwall Pack did not look at her when he blotted her name from the roll. He used 3 strokes, careful and unhurried, the way a man erases a mistake. King Aldrich stood behind him, with his arms at his sides and his eyes on the far wall. He had not looked at her once that morning. He would not look at her now. She was already gone, as far as he was concerned. She had been gone since the night he decided it. He simply needed the paperwork to confirm it. The crowd in the great hall watched without sound. 47 pairs of eyes. She counted them, because counting gave her something to do with her hands, and her hands wanted badly to shake. She did not let them. She stood with her boots on the stone floor and her spine straight, and she waited for the thing to be finished. The registrar lifted the blotter. Her name was 3 black bars now. Maren Holt. Gone. No, not Maren. She remembered herself. She was Vesper. She had always been Vesper. The name she carried in her own chest regardless of what any ledger said. He had erased one name. He had not touched the other. Aldrich turned from the wall then and looked at the room, not at her, at the room. His voice came out low and flat, the kind of voice that settled into the floor like weight. The matter is closed. That was all. The crowd shifted and parted, and he walked through it and out. And Vesper stood in the hall, with her blotted name at her back, and 47 people who did not know where to put their eyes, and she thought, good, let him believe it is closed. She picked up her pack from the floor beside her feet. 12 pounds she had weighed it that morning, everything she owned that mattered. She walked toward the east door, and nobody stopped her. Nobody said her name. That was fine. She knew what he did not know. She knew where she was going. She knew what was waiting for her at the border of Ashfen territory, 3 days east through hill country, where a different set of rolls were kept in a different kind of hand, and where a name, her name, had already been written in. 3 weeks ago, she had sent the letter. 2 weeks ago, she had received the answer. She had read it once, folded it, and tucked it under the insole of her left boot. She had walked on it every day since. The paper was soft as cloth by now. She did not need to read it again. She had memorized the words the first time. The Ashfen Pack extends recognition. The Ashfen Pack extends welcome. Come when you are ready. She stepped through the east door and into the morning air, and it was cold, 20 degrees of cold, the kind that strips the inside of the nose. She did not flinch. She had been cold before. She had been colder than this inside that hall. Aldrich had watched her arrive at Thornwall 7 years ago, 17 years old, and sent as a secondary tribute from a minor border sept, and he had given her exactly the same attention then as he gave her now. None. A steward had assigned her a bunk in the lower dormitory. A housekeeper named Wren had handed her a uniform and pointed at the laundry room. Vesper had put on the uniform and gone to work. 7 years she had worked. She had learned the pack rolls by the time she was 19. She had learned the ledgers by the time she was 21. By 23 she was the one who kept them. Every name, every bloodline, every debt, every alliance scratched into the great book that Thornwall's power rested on. She had learned other things too. She had learned which pages in that ledger were wrong, not errors, manipulations. She had found 26 of them over 4 years of quiet attention, cross-referenced against the original border treaties that nobody read anymore because they were stored in boxes at the back of the record room, and the boxes were heavy and dusty, and nobody wanted to move them. She had moved them. Alone, at night, over 11 separate sessions, she had made her own copies, careful and complete, in a hand that matched her own particular economy of script. Those copies were in the pack right now, folded, and oilcloth wrapped, between a spare shirt and a block of hard cheese. 26 manipulations. 3 of them involved Ashfen territory directly. 3 pieces of land that the Thornwall rolls claimed as pack holdings that the original treaties showed as Ashfen land, ceded and signed and sealed by a king 4 generations before Aldrich. She had written to the Ashfen chieftain, a man named Soren, and she had been precise and brief. She had not offered loyalty. She had offered information, verifiable information, in exchange for formal recognition and sanctuary. It was a trade, clean and honest. He had agreed. Aldrich had erased her name from the Thornwall rolls on a Tuesday morning. By Thursday evening, she would be standing inside the Ashfen border with documents that could redraw half the Eastern Territory lines. He had no idea. He had not looked at her in 7 years. He had not thought to wonder what she had been doing with her eyes. Vesper walked east. The hill road out of Thornwall was packed dirt, over frozen clay, and her boots found the grip without trouble. She had walked it 4 times before. Small errands, pack business, nothing that drew attention. This time, she carried everything she owned, and she did not look back. The morning was grey and still, frost on the dead grass to either side of the road. Her breath came in short white bursts that disappeared almost before they formed. She set a pace she could hold for 6 hours, and she held it. At the first rise she stopped, not from tiredness, from habit, and looked at the pack rooftops below. Grey slate, smoke from the kitchen chimneys, the north tower with its cracked bell that rang off-key on solstice mornings. She had lived inside those walls for 7 years. She felt nothing looking at them now, which surprised her a little, and then did not surprise her at all. You cannot mourn a place that never named you. A pair of ravens crossed above her and dropped into the valley on the far side of the hill. She watched them go, and then she walked. By midday, the road had narrowed to a track, and the track wound through stands of bare birch that clicked in the wind like bone. She ate while she walked. Hard cheese and a strip of salted meat she had bought from the kitchen stores 3 days ago, paid for from her own wages, nothing taken that was not hers. She had been careful about that. She needed clean hands when she arrived at Ashfen. No accusation of theft, no grounds for pursuit. The documents in her pack were copies, her own labor, made from records she had lawful access to in the course of her work. She had thought it through. She had been thinking it through for 2 years. The cold eased by the 2nd hour of afternoon, and a thin sun broke through cloud and put pale light on the birch trunks, and she felt something she would not have called happiness, but which lived next door to it. Room to breathe. That was what it was. Thornwall smelled like damp stone and rendered fat, and the particular close smell of too many people living without enough air. Out here it smelled like frozen earth and birch sap and something mineral coming off the distant hills that she had no name for. She breathed it deliberately, filled her lungs. She camped that night in a hollow between 2 rock outcrops where the wind came at her sideways, but the rocks broke the worst of it. She built a fire small enough to be no signal to anyone, and she ate the rest of her cheese and drank water from a stream that ran clear and cold over white stones. She did not think about Aldrich. She thought about what she was going to say when she met Soren. She had rehearsed it, but rehearsed was not the right word. She had reduced it, cut it down to the bones. She would present the documents. She would cite the treaty references. She would state the terms she required. She would not apologize. She would not thank him in advance. She had something he wanted. He had something she needed. That was all this was. The fire burned down, and she let it go. The stars came out clear and hard above her, and she counted them the way she had counted faces in the hall that morning. 47. She counted until she lost count, and then she slept. She was on the road before dawn. The second day was longer in distance and shorter in weather. The track climbed steadily through hill country, where the stone broke through the ground in long grey shelves, and the birches gave way to pine, and the pine gave way to open moor. She crossed the moor in 3 hours, with her head down against a thin, persistent drizzle that was not quite rain. On the far side of the moor, the ground dipped and a river appeared, the Ashwood River, wide and shallow and dark with peat. She crossed at the stones. The water came over the tops of her boots at mid-river, and she felt the cold of it move up her legs, and she crossed anyway without stopping. On the far bank she wrung out her socks, put them back wet, pulled her boots on and kept walking. There was a farmstead 1/2 mile on, with smoke in the chimney. She stopped there, and a woman of perhaps 60 came to the door and looked her over without alarm. Vesper asked for somewhere to dry her boots, and the woman looked at her feet and stood aside without another word. Inside the farmstead it was warm and low-ceilinged, and smelled of wood smoke, and the pungent green smell of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. The woman's name was Daga. She did not ask Vesper's name. She put a kettle on and pointed at a chair beside the fire. Vesper sat and pulled off her boots, and steam rose from her socks, and Dagi made tea and set a bowl of barley and salt pork on the table without ceremony. Vesper ate it and felt the warmth move into her hands. "You're from west of the river," Dagi said. "Not a question. I was. Thornwall people have a look." "What kind of look?" Dagi considered. "Like they're waiting for someone to correct them." The silence after that was flat and honest. Vesper drank her tea. Her socks dried in 20 minutes. She thanked Dagi and stood, and Dagi looked at her pack. "Ashfin House is 4 miles on the south road," Dagi said. "You'll know it by the copper gate." Vesper nodded and shouldered her pack and went out, and the drizzle had stopped, and the road was soft and wet, and she walked south. The copper gate was green with age, and twice her height, and it stood open. Vesper walked through it without breaking stride. The house beyond was long and low, and built from the same dark stone as the hills behind it, with a wide covered porch running the full front face, and 3 large dogs sleeping in a heap at the porch steps. The dogs raised their heads as she approached. She stopped and let them read the air between them, and after 4 slow seconds all 3 put their heads back down. She climbed the porch steps and knocked. A young man opened the door. He was perhaps 20, broad through the shoulder, with a nose that had been broken at least once, and a watchful set to his eyes. He looked at her, the way the dogs had, reading. "I have an appointment with Chieftain Sorin," Vesper said. "He's expecting me." "Name." "Vesper." Something moved in the young man's expression. Surprise, maybe. Then he stood aside. The entry hall was low and warm, stone floor, a long table against one wall, with maps on it, held flat by iron weights. The smell was wood smoke, and something else, pine resin, fresh, as if someone had been cutting timber nearby. She waited. She heard footsteps, unhurried, from somewhere to the left. Sorin came through a side door and stopped at the threshold and looked at her. He was perhaps 50, lean, with grey in his beard and brown in his eyes, and the kind of stillness that settled in a man who had made enough decisions to stop being surprised by consequences. He was not as tall as Aldrich, but he took up space differently, settled rather than imposed. He looked at her the way no one at Thornwall ever had, straight on, as if she was the thing he had been told to expect, and he intended to give the matter his full attention. "Vesper," he said. His voice was quiet and even. "You made good time. The road was clear. Come in." She followed him through the side door, into a room that was clearly a working study, bookshelves against every wall, a wide desk scattered with papers, and 2 oil lamps burning, despite the daylight, because the single window faced north and gave poor light. He pulled a chair to one side of the desk for her and sat behind it himself, and folded his hands on the papers and looked at her and waited. She unslung her pack. She drew out the oilcloth bundle. She set it on the desk between them. He did not reach for it. He watched her hands. "Before I open that," she said, "I want to state the terms I'm here for. Go ahead." Formal recognition in the Ashfen rolls. My name, full, with the date. Not provisional, not conditional, permanent. Agreed. Workshop access. I'm a trained records keeper. I want to continue that work. Here. Also agreed. And when Thornwall challenges the documents, and they will challenge them, I want Ashfen to stand behind the treaty references and not negotiate them away for a quiet settlement. There was a pause that lasted exactly long enough to be a real consideration rather than a performance of one. "That one will cost both of us more," Soren said. "I know. You're still asking for it. I am." He unfolded his hands. He reached forward and drew the oilcloth bundle toward him and unfolded it with care and laid the documents flat on the desk, and he read the first page without speaking. She watched his face. He read the way she did, thoroughly and without expression. He turned a page, then another. Then he looked up. 26, he said. "Yes, and you copied all of these yourself. Over 2 years, 11 nights, alone. He looked back at the documents and turned another page and was quiet for a moment. "They erased your name this morning," he said. "Yes." He set the page down and looked at her, and something in his face shifted. Not pity. She would have stood up and walked out for pity. Something harder. Something that recognized a particular kind of transaction. "I'll have my registrar prepare the entry tonight," he said. "You'll be in the rolls by morning." The silence after that was full and still. She let it rest. Then she nodded once and said, "Good," and meant it as the final word of a completed negotiation. It was. That night she slept in a room with a door that latched from the inside, a thing so ordinary that she lay in the dark for several minutes, just aware of it. The latch. On her side of the door. She pressed her palm to the cold wall beside the bed and felt the stone and listened to the house settle around her, and she slept without dreaming. Morning came gray and slow. She washed her face in cold water from the basin and dressed and went downstairs and found the kitchen by the smell of it, wood smoke and grain porridge, and something that might have been coffee, real coffee, which she had not had in 2 years because Thornwall had stopped importing it after a trade dispute, and no one had thought to resume. The young man from the door, his name was Colt, she had learned it the night before, was already at the table with a bowl in front of him and a map spread to his left. He looked up when she came in and pointed at the pot on the stove without speaking. She poured herself a cup and sat down at the far end of the table and wrapped her hands around the cup and drank. The coffee was bitter and strong, and she felt it move into her chest like something unlocking. There was an older woman at the stove, heavy-set and quick-moving, who put a bowl of porridge in front of Vesper without being asked, and said, "Eat it before it goes cold," and went back to her work. Her name was Halsa, and she ran the kitchen the way a ship's mate runs a deck, with a clear sense of who belonged where, and no patience for ceremony. Vesper ate. Soren came in when she was halfway through the bowl. He poured his own coffee and sat across from her, and unfolded a paper he had been carrying, and slid it across the table. She set down her spoon and read it. It was a formal notation, her name, written in a careful registrar's hand. Vesper, the date. Below it the words, "Received and recorded as full member, Ashfen Pack, under the authority of Chieftain Soren of Ashfen, witnessed." 2 witness signatures below. She looked at the page for a long time. She was not going to name what she felt looking at it. She did not need to. It was there, in the way her hands tightened on the edge of the paper, in the way she breathed. "The registrar will transfer this to the permanent rolls today," Soren said. "You'll have your own copy. Thank you. No, thank you. What you brought me will take months to verify, and then more months to act on, but it is real, and it is documented, and it does not go away. He drank his coffee. Where did you learn records work? At Thornwall. I taught myself for the first 2 years. After that, I had access to the main archive. And they didn't wonder why an Omega tribute from a minor sept was spending her evenings in the record room. It was not a question. She answered it anyway. They didn't look, she said. That was the thing. They never looked. There it was again, the particular silence that seemed to characterize Soren's responses. Not absence of thought, but presence of it. A space where he was actually processing, rather than preparing his next line. The workshop is in the East Wing, he said. I'll have Colt show you after you finish eating. She looked at Colt, who was still studying his map and pretending not to listen to the conversation. He looked up when he felt her attention and gave a small nod and went back to the map. She finished her porridge. She finished her coffee. She washed her own bowl at the basin without being asked, because she had always washed her own bowl. It had simply been 30 seconds of the day nobody witnessed, and she followed Colt through the east corridor to the workshop. The room was long and narrow, with shelves along the north wall and a double window on the south, letting in clean morning light. On the shelves were ledgers, dozens of them, in various conditions, and a set of treaty boxes that looked as if they had not been opened in years. On the central work table, there were stacks of papers, weighted by smooth river stones. The room smelled of old paper and ink, and the faint mineral smell she associated now with Ashfen itself. She stood in the doorway and looked at it. It's a mess, Colt said. He said it as a plain assessment, no apology. I know. Soren's been meaning to have it sorted for 2 years. Nobody's had the time. She stepped inside. She picked up the nearest ledger and opened it to the middle and read a page. The hand was legible, the entries inconsistent. The dating system changed partway through, and nobody had reconciled the two systems. She set it down and picked up the treaty box nearest to her and opened it and looked at the first document inside. The sealing wax was intact. The treaty was 80 years old. She felt a particular calm settle over her, the kind that came when a task was enormous and clear and completely within her ability. Tell Soren I'll need a week to assess what's here, she said, and then I'll need 6 months to fix it. Colt looked at her. He'll want a shorter estimate. He'll want an accurate one more. Colt was quiet for a second. Then quietly he said, Fair. He left her to it. She pulled a blank ledger from the shelf and opened it on the work table and found the ink pot and tested the pen and began the first page of an inventory. Her handwriting was small and consistent, 15 words to the line, no wasted space, the same economy she had used for 7 years in a room where nobody watched. Here, somebody would eventually look at what she had built and recognize the work for what it was. She did not need that yet. She needed to begin. She began. 3 days into the sorting, and a rider came from Thornwall. Vesper heard the hoofbeats from the workshop window and went still and listened, but did not stop writing. She heard voices in the entry hall, the low hum of the rider's report, Soren's brief responses, the door again. Footsteps. Soren appeared in the workshop doorway and leaned against the frame and looked at her. They've sent a formal demand, he said. Demanding what? Your return. They're calling it a theft. They say you took restricted documents from the archive. She set down the pen. She had expected this. She had timed it. She had thought it would take 4 days. They had managed it in 3, which meant someone had noticed the copies were missing sooner than she had anticipated. Not the copies themselves, the originals. They must have finally read the originals. They're wrong on the theft, she said. The copies are mine. My labor, my materials, made during my off hours. I know that. I told them so. What was the rider's manner? Formal, a little loud. Who sent him? He carried Aldrich's seal. She felt the name land in the room, like something dropped from height. She had not spoken it in 3 days. She had not let herself think it in any formed way. The name, and what it carried, 7 years of invisible labor, 47 faces in a great hall, 3 strokes of a blotter. She picked up the pen again. "Send back a written response," she said, formal, citing the treaty provisions. "I'll draft it if you want. I'll draft it myself. But I want your language on the treaty citations. Tonight." He looked at the stacks of ledgers around her, the notes filling the blank book, the riverstone weights. "You're not frightened," he said. It was almost a question. "I'm working," she said. Which was an answer to a different question, and they both knew it. He pushed off the doorframe and went back down the corridor, and she listened to his steps fade, and then she looked out the south window at the sky, which was high and pale and cold and indifferent, and she felt the trembling start in her right hand, the one holding the pen. She watched it. She kept the pen still through the trembling, and she breathed, and after 30 seconds, the trembling stopped. She noted it, the way she noted everything, as information, as data, as something to account for. Then she went back to the inventory. The response went out the next morning with Ashfen's rider, a young woman on a pale horse who sat in her saddle with the particular ease of someone who had been riding longer than she had been walking. Vesper watched her go from the porch, and Colt came and stood beside her. "Aldrich will be angry," Colt said. "Probably. Have you met him?" She considered whether to answer that. "He watched someone erase my name," she said. "He didn't say anything." Colt was quiet for a moment. Then, "What kind of man watches that and says nothing?" "The kind who doesn't think there's anything worth saying. The kind who looks at a woman who has run his archive for 4 years and sees the work but not the person doing it." She turned away from the road and went back inside. Behind her, Colt did not follow immediately. She heard him stay on the porch for another moment, as if he was looking down the road where the rider had gone, as if he was thinking something through to the end of it. Then his steps came after her. Aldrich's reply arrived in 5 days. Not another rider. Aldrich himself. Vesper was in the workshop when Halsa appeared in the doorway, with her face doing something complicated. Not alarm, not quite, but the particular expression of a person who had seen enough to know that a thing had become serious. "The Thornwall king is at the gate," Halsa said. "With how many?" 8 riders." She kept her voice even. She set down the pen. She stood and pressed her palms flat on the work table for 1 second, feeling the solid wood. "Tell Soren," she said. Halsa disappeared. Vesper looked at the south window and the grey light and breathed in through her nose, held it, let it go. Then she went to the shelf and took down the oilcloth bundle of copies. She untied it and laid out the 3 documents that dealt with the disputed Ashfen land, the 3 most important ones, the ones with the original treaty seals intact. She placed them in a separate, smaller bundle and tied it with a clean cord. She picked it up and went out of the workshop and down the east corridor and into the main hall. Soren was already there, standing to the right of the front door, with Colt at his shoulder. 2 more Ashfen men she had seen, but not spoken to, were positioned to the left. They all looked at her when she came in. She went and stood beside Soren, and he glanced at the bundle in her hands and said nothing. The front door opened. Aldrich came in. He was taller than she remembered, which was not possible, since she had seen him daily for 7 years. It was the space, she thought. In Thornwall's great hall, he was scaled to something she was accustomed to. Here, in this lower-ceilinged room, he was simply large, broad in the shoulder, heavy in the way that came from real weight rather than excess, with black hair showing grey at the temples, and a jaw like something carved rather than grown. He wore travel clothes, dark wool, and he smelled of horse and cold road. He had crossed the same ground she had crossed 5 days ago. She noticed that, and then set it aside. He looked at Soren first. Then, after a beat that was too deliberate to be accidental, he looked at her. She held the look. He had not looked at her in 7 years. She was prepared to hold it for as long as it required. He was the one who looked away first, back to Soren. "Chieftain," he said. His voice was the same, low, physical, the kind of voice that seemed to originate somewhere below the chest. "We have a matter to discuss." "We have several," Soren said. "Come in." Aldrich walked into the room. His riders stayed outside. She could hear the copper gate swing shut behind them. He looked around the hall, the maps on the table, the iron weights, the shelves. He took the room in the way a man takes in something he intends to acquire, and she watched him doing it, and she felt something old and cold settle into the base of her spine. Not fear. She was past fear with him. Something quieter, something that had been waiting patiently for this exact moment for 2 years. He looked at her again. He looked at the bundle in her hands. "That is Thornwall property," he said. "No," she said, "it isn't." The silence that came after those 2 words was the longest of the morning. Aldrich stood with his travel coat still on, and his eyes on her, and the room waited. Soren folded his hands behind his back and did not speak. Colt was very still to Soren's right. Vesper held the bundle and did not move, and did not look away, and Aldrich's jaw worked once, slowly, as if he was measuring something. "Those documents came from Thornwall's archive," he said. "The copies came from my hands," she said. "My labor, my materials, my off-hours. No Thornwall resource was expended. No original document was removed. The information in them is pack property. The information in the originals is pack property. What I made with my own hands in my own time is mine." He took 1 step closer, not threatening, not exactly, claiming space, which was what he did. She had watched him do it for 7 years in every room he entered. "You had a responsibility to the pack," he said. "I served that responsibility for 7 years," she said. "And then Thornwall erased my name and released me from it. You can't claim both. Either I was a member of your pack with obligations, in which case you had no right to erase my name, or I was property to be disposed of, in which case I owed you nothing past the day of disposal. Pick one." Something moved through his face. She could not have named it. It crossed his eyes like a shadow crosses water, too fast and too deep to read exactly. He looked at Soren. "These documents represent a significant claim against Thornwall's territorial records," he said. "They do," Soren said. "The claim will require formal review. I'm prepared to begin that process immediately, with appropriate witnesses from both packs and from the border authority at Caldwell. That will take months. It will take as long as it takes to do correctly." Aldrich looked at the bundle in Vesper's hands again. She extended it across the space between them, and he looked at it and then at her, and his eyes asked a question she did not answer. "They're copies," she said. "The originals are in your archive. They've been there for 80 years. All I did was read them." He took the bundle. He held it without opening it. He looked at her as if she was something that had been in his house for 7 years, that he had walked past every day, and he was only now registering what it was. It was not comfortable to be looked at that way. It was not unpleasant either. She had waited a long time to be seen, and she was under no obligation to make it easy for him. "You knew about these before you were removed from the rolls," he said. "I knew about them for 2 years. He went very still. "Why didn't you bring them to me?" It was not quite a question. The inflection was too flat. She answered it anyway. "When would I have done that?" He had nothing to say to that. He was honest enough not to pretend he had an answer. She could see him running the 2 years backward in his mind, mapping the times she had been in a room with him, or near a room with him, or down a corridor from him. She watched him arrive at the same count she had already run. The answer was 12 times. She had been near enough to speak to him 12 times in 2 years. He had not registered her presence on any of those occasions. She had counted. "I see," he said. His voice had changed. Something had gone out of it. Not the weight was still there, but the authority in it, the flat assumption that everything in the room arranged itself around his position. That was different now. "I'd like to stay for the review process," he said to Soren. "That's your right," Soren said. "I'll have rooms prepared." He turned to go with Soren, and then he stopped. He looked back at Vesper, and she was ready for almost anything, except what he actually said. He said, "I don't know your name." She looked at him. She felt the full weight of that sentence, and what it meant, and what it cost him to say it out loud, in front of Soren and Colt, and the two other men, and the Ashfen house walls, and the cold grey sky outside the north window. She decided to be honest. "My name is Vesper," she said. He held that for a moment. He turned it over. He said nothing further, and he walked with Soren toward the south corridor, and she watched him go, and felt the old, cold thing at the base of her spine loosen, just slightly, the way a knot loosens when you find the right end to pull. Aldrich stayed. He had sent 6 of his riders back to Thornwall with a message she was not privy to, and kept 2 men with him for the duration of the review, which Soren convened 4 days after the confrontation in the main hall. The border review required a neutral party from Caldwell, who arrived on day 6, a thin, older man named Pell, who wore glasses and carried his own set of weights for the document scale, and who spent the first full day reading the original treaty copies without speaking to anyone at all. Vesper ran the workshop. She put Colt to work on the cross-referencing, teaching him the notation system as she went, and she found it suited him, the methodical back and forth between source document and ledger entry, the satisfaction of the thing clicking into place. He learned quickly, and without ego, which was the second rarest thing in a work partner, after patience. She kept herself occupied. She was good at that. She had been keeping herself occupied for 7 years. Aldrich came to the workshop doorway on the 3rd day, and stood there, and she looked up, and then went back to her work. He did not speak immediately. He stood in the doorway for perhaps a full minute, looking at the shelves, the ledgers, the work on the table, the way she moved through it. Then he said, "Can I come in?" She was aware of how the question was phrased, not whether he could, but whether he was permitted. She noted that, "If you don't move anything," she said. He came in and stood to her left and looked at what she was doing. "You're building a new indexing system," he said. "The existing one is inconsistent. 3 different hands over 60 years, and no standardization between them. Is that common?" She looked up. He was asking in earnest. She could hear it. "More common than you'd think," she said. "People add to a system rather than rebuild it. After a generation, the accumulation makes it effectively unreadable." "And Thornwall's system?" She was quiet for a beat. "Thornwall's system was well maintained," she said. "Before me, I don't know. In my time, it was consistent." He said nothing. She went back to her notation. He stood there for another few minutes, and then he said, "What you said in the hall, about the 12 times. She set the pen down. "I didn't say 12 times, she said. "I didn't say a number." "No," he said. "You didn't. I counted afterward." She looked at him. His face was arranged in the particular careful way of someone who had prepared himself to hear something unpleasant and was holding himself open for it. 7 years, he said. 7, yes, and I didn't know your name. You knew what the work was, she said. The work was there, every time you opened a ledger, or checked a border record, or signed a membership roll. You just didn't know who was doing it. That is not a satisfying distinction. No, she said, it isn't. He looked at the ledger on the table between them, and then looked up and met her eyes, and she held the look, and this time he did not look away. He stayed in it. That was different too. That was the thing that was making the cold knot at her spine loosen by degrees, each day a little more, not because she was softening, because she was watching him change. Not performing change, actually changing, undertaking the harder and more genuine alteration that came from a person who looked at a thing they had done and could not call it anything other than what it was. The review will likely find in Ashfen's favor on at least 2 of the 3 disputed territories, she said. I know. That will be a significant loss for Thornwall. I know that too, and your counsel will blame you for it. He said nothing. I want you to know I didn't do this to damage Thornwall, she said. I did it because it was true. The records were wrong. The wrong needed correcting. I needed somewhere that would let me correct it. He looked at her for a long time. You needed somewhere that would see you, he said. It was the plainest thing he had said since he arrived, and it landed with the weight of something he had not intended to say, and could not now take back. She picked up the pen and went back to her work. She did not answer him. Some sentences did not need an answer. They needed to hang in the room and be heard. Pell delivered his preliminary findings on the 8th day in the same side room where Vesper had first laid the documents on Soren's desk. Soren sat to the left of the table. Aldrich sat to the right. Vesper sat at the end, at Soren's invitation, because she had sourced the documents and Pell had requested her presence for clarification. Pell stood and read from his written notes in a dry and even voice that suggested he had delivered inconvenient findings to powerful men before, and found it no more difficult than any other administrative task. The first disputed territory, 11 square miles of grazing land east of the Thornwall foothills, was Ashfen's by the original treaty. The documentation was unambiguous. The subsequent Thornwall additions to the land rolls were made without treaty authority and constituted a recording error. He used the words recording error with the precision of a man who knew that they were not those words, but who also knew what his job was and what it was not. The second territory, 6 miles of river access on the Ashwood's northern fork, was also Ashfen's. The third, a strip of border forest, was less clear. The treaty language was genuinely ambiguous, and Pell recommended binding arbitration at the Caldwell Authority before any entry was amended. Aldrich listened without expression. Soren listened without expression. Vesper listened and watched both of them simultaneously. A habit. She had been reading rooms her entire adult life. When Pell finished, the room was quiet for a full 30 seconds. Nobody moved. Then Soren said, "Thank you, Pell," and Pell gathered his papers and left. Then it was just the 3 of them. Aldrich put both hands flat on the table. He looked at the surface of it for a moment, as if reading something there. "Thornwall accepts the finding on the first territory," he said, "subject to formal documentation." "Of course," Soren said. "The second territory." Aldrich paused. "Subject to a negotiated transition timeline." Soren nodded. "Reasonable." "The third, I'll refer to my counsel before agreeing to arbitration." "Also reasonable." The silence came back, smaller this time, just the 3 of them in it. Aldrich looked up from the table and across at Vesper. She held the look. "The documents would have stayed buried," he said, "if you hadn't found them." "They were always there," she said. "Someone was going to find them eventually, but it was you. It was me." He nodded once, as if that settled something. It did not settle everything. She knew that, and he knew that, and Soren knew it too, but it settled the first piece, and the first piece was enough to go on with. Soren stood, and the meeting was over, and she walked back to the workshop and stood at the south window and looked out at the hills and felt the thing that was not happiness, but lived right beside it, come back into her chest, steady and clear, like light coming through good glass. The second night after the review, Aldrich came to the workshop again. Later, after dinner, after the house had gone quiet, she heard his steps in the corridor and recognized them. She had spent 7 years in a building where his footsteps moved overhead. She would know them anywhere. He knocked on the doorframe. She looked up. "The treaty on the river access," he said, "the original language." "Can I read it?" She retrieved the document from the shelf and handed it to him, and he read it standing at the table in the lamplight. She went back to her work, and they were quiet together, in the way that two people are quiet, when neither of them is pretending the quiet is comfortable, and neither of them needs it to be. He read for 20 minutes. He set the document down. "It's clear," he said. "Yes," she said. "My registrar should have caught this 40 years ago. Yes, should have been looking, should have been reading the originals, not just the summary rolls. Yes." He looked at her, "like you did." She set the pen down. She looked at him. The lamplight was orange, and the shadows behind him were long, and the room smelled of paper and ink, and the pine resin that threaded through everything in this house. "What are you asking me?" she said. "I'm not sure yet," he said. He said it plainly, and without embarrassment, and she found that she could not hold it against him. A man who had spent his entire life being certain of things was standing in a workshop doorway, in borrowed candlelight, admitting that he was not sure. She had waited 7 years to be seen. She could wait a few more days for him to find the words. 10 days into the review, the Thornwall Council sent a second rider. Not with demands this time, with questions. Vesper heard Aldrich take the message in the south corridor, and she did not try to hear the content, but she heard the tone of his voice as he dismissed the rider, which was the tone of a man who had expected the questions and was already annoyed by them. He came to find her afterward. She was in the kitchen with Halsa, helping to sort the root vegetables from the cellar stores, because Halsa had asked, and because it was a reasonable use of an afternoon, when the main ledger work was waiting on Pell's written report. They sat across from each other with a basket between them, and Aldrich came to the kitchen door and looked at the situation. A king of Thornwall standing in a doorway, looking at the woman who had upended his territorial records, sorting turnips with his host's cook, and Halsa looked at him and said, "Sit down, or get out. I need the doorway." And Aldrich, to Vesper's privately noted surprise, sat down. Halsa put a pile of carrots in front of him. He looked at them. He picked one up and held it. "The council wants me back," he said to Vesper. "What does your council think of the findings?" "They're unhappy. That's not an answer to what I asked." He put the carrot down and picked up another one, as if he was considering it carefully. "They want to challenge the document's provenance," he said. "On what grounds?" "That you weren't authorized to make copies." She set down a turnip. "In whose name did the archive operate?" He was quiet. "Was there a standing policy against copying?" He was quiet again. "Did I ever receive a written instruction prohibiting it?" "No," he said. "Then they have no grounds, and they know they have no grounds, and you know it too." Halsa moved behind them, cutting something, the rhythm of the knife on the board steady and unhurried. Aldrich looked at the carrot in his hand. "I need to tell them that," he said. "Yes, they won't like it." "They don't have to like it, they have to abide by it." He set the carrot down and looked at her, fully and directly, the way she was beginning to recognize as his particular way of attending to a thing when he had decided it mattered. "When the review is complete," he said, "and the records are amended." He stopped. "Say the rest of it," she said. "I want you to come back to Thornwall." The kitchen was full of the smell of cut carrots and wood smoke, and the sound of Halsa's knife, which had not paused and would not pause, because Halsa was exactly the kind of person who kept doing the work while enormous things happened nearby. Vesper looked at Aldrich. She looked at the carrot he had set down. She looked at the basket between them. "No," she said. "He absorbed that." "No to what part?" "No to coming back on those terms. You're asking me to return to a place where I've been erased. You haven't said anything about restoring my name. You haven't offered anything. You've said, 'Come back,' and I'm supposed to understand what that means." "I want your name in the Thornwall rolls," he said. "Under what entry?" He understood what she was asking. She could see it in the stillness that came over him, the held breath of a man who had reached the edge of something and was looking over. "Under mine," he said. She let that sit. "I'm in the Ashfen rolls," she said. "I have a position here. I have a workspace, and a commission, and an agreement with Soren that is not contingent on anyone's feelings about me. I know. You're asking me to give that up. I'm asking, he said, because I don't know how else to say that I understand what I did, what I failed to do. I'm asking because there is no formal way to say it that covers the whole of it, and I don't have anything else. She was quiet for a long time. Halsa's knife kept its rhythm. Outside the kitchen window, the light was going, the grey afternoon bleeding into the darker grey of early evening. She put her hands on the table and looked at them. Talk to Soren, she said finally. Tell him what you told me. Let him and me work out the terms together, and then ask me again. Something went through Aldrich's face. Not relief. It was too early for relief. Something closer to the particular steadiness of a person who has been given a task and is now certain of what to do. He stood up from the table. He looked at Halsa, who did not look up from her cutting. Thank you, he said, and Vesper was not certain whether he meant the kitchen, or the chair, or the conversation. But Halsa said, Carrots go in the left bin, and he picked up the carrot he had set down and put it in the left bin, and he left. Vesper looked at the turnip in her hands. Then she set it in the right bin and reached for another one. She and Soren talked the next morning in his study, with the north window showing a white sky and the oil lamps lit low. He listened to all of it and asked 3 questions, and then folded his hands on the desk and was quiet for a moment. You want to go, he said. Not a question. I want to go on terms that are mine, she said. You understand the difference. I do. He looked at the desk. He spoke to me last night, he said. Aldrich. I know. He was more honest than I expected. He's been more honest than I expected for 10 days now, she said. It keeps catching me off guard. Soren looked at her. Something in his expression was dry and almost fond. He'll make mistakes, he said. I know. The council will fight the records amendment for at least a year. I know that too. You know what you're walking back into, she nodded. And you know what you're leaving. He said it without weight, but she felt it anyway. She had come to Ashfen with nothing but her name and 12 pounds on her back, and they had given her a room with a latch and coffee in the morning, and a workshop that smelled of old paper, and Colt, who learned quickly and without ego, and Halsa, who said, Eat it before it goes cold, and Soren, who read documents straight through without theatre, and agreed to things because they were reasonable rather than because they were convenient. She would not forget this. She intended to say so. I know what I'm leaving, she said, and I want to say clearly that I know. This place gave me something I'm going to carry. I'm not taking it for granted. He nodded. The workshop commission, he said. The indexing work. It doesn't have to end, because you go back. What are you saying? I'm saying there are things in those shelves that are going to take longer than 6 months. I'm saying if Thornwall's records keeper happened to also hold a formal advisory role with Ashfen for the purposes of the territory review, that would be within the rights of both packs under the Border Authority Charter. She looked at him. He looked at her, with the even attention of a man who had already thought this through and was simply waiting for her to catch up. You want me in both, she said. I want the work done correctly, he said. And I want you in a position where Thornwall has no grounds to dispute your authority on the documents, because you hold formal standing in the pack that brought the case. It was neat, and it was complete, and it was the kind of thinking she had not expected. She sat with it for a moment. Aldrich would have to agree, she said. Let him agree, Soren said. Let it be his choice to make. She thought about that, about the shape of it, a name in 2 roles, not erased from one and carried in the other, but carried in both, full and permanent and clear. She thought about what it would mean to walk back into Thornwall not as a return, not as a surrender, but as a standing member of the pack that had just corrected Thornwall's records and was owed 2 territories by law. She felt something she had not felt in 2 years. She felt the weight go out of her spine. Not gone, set down. deliberately, on a surface solid enough to hold it. "Draft the advisory agreement tonight," she said. "I'll review it in the morning." He was already reaching for the pen. Aldrich agreed to the advisory role in 4 minutes. She had not expected that either, the speed of it, the absence of negotiation. He read the terms Soren had drafted, and he looked up and said, "Yes," and that was the whole of it. She was watching his face when he read, and she saw the moment he understood what it meant, not just the legal architecture of it, but the fact of it, the thing it was correcting, and his jaw tightened, and then released, and he said yes, and signed it. The 3 of them, Soren, Aldrich, and Vesper, went to the workshop where Soren's registrar had been waiting, and the registrar opened the Ashfen book to her entry and added the advisory notation below her name in a clear, unhurried hand. Then Aldrich took the pen. The registrar produced the Thornwall travelling roll, the official copy that Aldrich carried with his seal for matters arising outside the home territory, and he turned to the page where her name had been, and he wrote it back in. Vesper, full name, date. The entry beneath it was his own notation, written in his hand, not the registrar's, restored, with full standing, under seal of the Aldrich, King of Thornwall. She stood at the table and looked at it. The ink was still wet. She thought of a different ink, 3 weeks ago, and a different table, and 3 strokes of a blotter, and 47 pairs of eyes pointed anywhere but at her face. The same ink, different hands, this time his. He set down the pen and stood beside her, and looked at what he had written, and she heard his breathing, close and deliberate, the controlled breath of a man who understood exactly what he was doing, and the size of it. "I owe you more than a line in a book," he said. "I know," she said. "But start there." He looked at her. She looked at the entry. Wet ink drying on vellum, her name pressed into the permanent record by a king's own hand, and the Ashfen notation still above it in the matching book, and somewhere back in Thornwall's main archive, the originals she had spent 2 years cross-referencing, sat in their boxes, exactly as she had left them, waiting for someone to do the work. She knew who would do it. She picked up the pen, and she signed the advisory agreement on the final line, and the registrar added his witness mark, and Soren folded the document with care, and set it on the shelf, with the weight of a man placing something where it belongs. Colt was in the doorway. She had not heard him arrive. He was looking at the shelf where the agreement sat, and his expression was the expression of a person watching a thing come right after a long time of being wrong. She caught his eye. He gave a small nod. Not congratulation, not ceremony, just acknowledgement, one person to another, of a fact now established. She accepted it the same way. 3 days later, she and Aldrich rode west toward Thornwall together. She rode her own horse, a thick-legged bay she had arranged to borrow from Soren's stables, because she had not had a horse of her own when she left, and she was not going to ride behind anyone. Aldrich rode to her left, and they went at her pace, which was steady, and he did not push ahead. The hill road was familiar now, in both directions. Frost on the grass, grey sky, breath in white bursts, the same cold that had been there 3 weeks ago, when she walked it alone, with 12 pounds on her back, and a letter under her boot. She rode over the place where she had stopped, and looked back at the Thornwall rooftops, and she did not stop this time. She looked forward. The road went down through the birch stands, and the birches were still bare, and still clicking in the wind, and the sound was familiar now too, part of the landscape of those 3 weeks, part of the record. She would carry it, Aldrich said, almost nothing on the road. Once, descending through the last of the birches before the Thornwall valley came into view, he said, "The council will want a meeting first thing. I know. I'll run it. I know that too. I want you in the room." She looked at him sideways. "As what?" "As the person who knows the records better than anyone else in the room," he said, "and as the Ashfen advisory member, so they understand exactly who they're talking to." She looked at the road ahead. She felt the thing that had loosened in her spine these past 2 weeks settle fully now, not the absence of weight, but the presence of something else in its place, something solid, something she had built herself out of 12 pounds of copies and 2 years of patience and 11 nights alone with heavy boxes. "All right," she said. They came out of the birches, and the Thornwall valley opened below them, grey slate rooftops and kitchen smoke, and the North Tower with its off-key bell, and she looked at it and felt something she had not felt before. Not warmth, not yet, but possibility. The road down was clear, and she took it at a steady pace, and Aldrich kept to her left, and the valley came up to meet them, and the gate, when they reached it, was open. The morning light was pale and winter thin, and it fell through the open gate onto the stone road, and she rode through it, and into the yard, and the yard was full of people who had gathered. She did not know why. Word travelled fast in a pack, and 47 was too small a number now. There were more than that. Faces she knew, and faces she did not, and they were all looking at her. She sat straight on the borrowed horse, and looked back at them, and she was not afraid, and she was not apologetic, and she was not asking permission for a single inch of the space she occupied. She was Vesper. She was in the roles. She was here, on her own terms. That was the whole of the story. A name erased with 3 strokes of a blotter, written back in by the hand that erased it. Before the ink was dry, she had made it permanent. What you didn't see coming was not her anger, it was her patience. And now you've seen the end of it. She had not come back to belong to this place. She had come back because this place was going to have to learn to belong to her. If this story got under your skin the way it should, you already know the feeling it's reaching for, that quiet, certain moment when a person who was never given their due simply takes it, not with violence, not with noise, but with 2 years of work and 1 clean signature on a line that cannot be undone. If you felt that, you have good taste, and I'm glad you're here. Like this one, if it hit the way you wanted it to. Share it with someone who knows what it means to be underestimated for too long. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story when it drops. And leave me something in the comments. When Aldrich came to the workshop that first evening and read the treaty himself, was that the moment you started to believe he could actually change, or did you need more from him before you were convinced? Tell me where it turned for you. The copper gate is still open. Come back soon.